but it has to confer on the company a very specific identity. And therefore, really in organization where culture works, it is very distinctive and very unique, and it confers a distinctive identity on the company, and it's not motherhood cookie cutter statements of what this organization believes in terms of modes of conduct or certain terminal states of existence that you want the company to move towards. And I think it's important to also understand the difference between having the culture lived and the practice, because if you go to companies and ask them what your values are, even though there's only 5 or 6 values that the company has, a lot of people struggle to recall all the 5 or 6. Although it is right there prominently displayed on every factory floor, every boardroom, in the hallways of the company, but it is mere words. So in order for those stuff to take root and get institutionalized in the company, you have to be very courageous to have the very difficult conversations, particularly with your heavy hitters, people who are really bringing home the bacon, so to speak, in the company. If they are violating those behaviors or those values or those modes of conduct that you hold dear as part of your value system, as part of your culture. And that is a very difficult thing to do. Very few companies successfully do that. So if you're not willing to suffer the pain of institutionalizing a culture in the company, you should never go down that path. Because everybody in the company can then see that's a big hoax, that you don't believe at all in what you're saying, because you're not willing to have the tough conversations and willing to remove a star performer because he's not conforming to the collaborative teamwork that he wanted to embed as one element of your culture. And you must make a distinction between core values and aspirational values. I go to a lot of companies where they say that this is the value as part of a shared culture, and you ask them, so you're very good at this? They say, no, we're terrible at this. But we're aspiring that that will be part of the culture. That's a very different ballgame. Where what you're talking about in terms of core values is what really makes you different, distinctive, which confers that special identity on the company, which all the people in the organization can identify with. And it's also not about accidental values. You know, Steve Jobs used to always wear a black turtleneck sweater and jeans. And some people in Apple thought that was Apple's culture. So everybody went and got out, you know, jeans and turtleneck tops. So that is not a core value, that's an accidental value, and I think we should make a distinction between those.
Thank you.
Well, just picking up this whole thing about culture, I think let me talk about culture and casting, because these are two things that go hand in hand in big organizations. Firstly, culture transcends boundaries. Corporate culture transcends boundaries. Particularly if you have an organization like ours, for example, that's been around for 140 years, whether you go to Africa, you go to the United States, or you go to Asia, there is something Unilever about Unilever, okay? And therefore culture definitely transcends boundaries. The second bit is that when culture clashes with strategy, culture always wins. In other words, you have to recognize that if you want to be an agent of change, it's very, very difficult to do it with strategy. Because strategy will always get trumped by culture. And that brings me to the very important bit. When you have a job to be done in an organization, that is different. Let's talk about frontiers. Let's talk about opening new markets, or doing something different. That's where casting comes in. Because even within organizations, there are people with different capabilities and different mindsets. I always say that you've got to find people who believe in what Mark Twain always spoke about. Don't let school get in the way of education. Okay? And there are people in organizations, even in very organized organizations, which actually are able to be entrepreneurial, break some rules. I mean, break not code of business principles, but some rules in order to get ahead. And I think you have to find the right people at the right time, in the right place. And casting therefore becomes really critical if you want to really change culture or have a subculture within a culture. The last bit is that when you compete as a global company, you have to remember that there is no point competing in a market like a local company. You have to be locally relevant but globally leveraged. As I always say, you've got to bring the might of your organization. In our case, we're a $60 billion organization. In every single market, whether it's Ghana or Timbuktu, which you know about, you've got to make sure that you operate as a $65 billion company. Otherwise, you will be just another local company. Having said that, it's critical that the culture and the mindset of people working in markets is not the old famous saying when all of us were growing up in business schools, which was all about think global, act local. I think that's a bit of nonsense. Always think local, because there's no such thing as a global consumer. You know, you don't walk around in the streets of Singapore and people shake your hand and say, hello, I'm a global consumer. There are no global consumers. There are only local consumers. So you've got to think local, but then you've got to act global. You've got to bring the might of your organization, your capabilities, etc., to really address the needs of local consumers. So those are the two things, culture, casting, and really about thinking local but acting global.
One thing I want to supplement to that, the question of can an organization have split personalities? I think that's a real risk. I don't think you can have a multicultural, or at least maybe you can. I don't think it's a good thing to have a multicultural organization. So when I was at Citi, which I was for most of my life, I found that Citi's merger with the Travelers Group, which tried to marry the culture of a hardcore investment bank, which was Solly, with the culture of a commercial bank, which was Citi, was really woeful. And I found that the fractions it created, the lack of cohesiveness and synergy, or lack of dyssynergy it created, was just not worth the effort. So at DBS, one of the things that I'm quite fixated on is we will not import in businesses into the company which are going to vitiate the culture. And even if it means doing things the wrong way or long way, or even if it means actually not doing some things altogether, but anything which compromises the culture that we have and the culture we're trying to build is not worth it.
I completely agree with you, but I'd probably here it's more mincing words rather than anything else. Look, all of us have, if you look at business as a collection of clients, products, and geography. If it's about growing an existing product in an existing geography with an existing customer base, you would have a certain type of manager and a certain type of approach you take. Whereas if you're going in with a new product into a new geography, you need a completely different type of manager, a more entrepreneur, with the entrepreneurial approach within the confines of the culture of the company. So I think it's important. So I think yes, as companies need to be schizophrenic, but you need to have a consistent culture. And I absolutely agree. You shouldn't allow strategy to trump culture, but you need to be schizophrenic.
Thank you. So now over to the audience, and we probably have some questions coming in. So I'm going to be very provocative and actually get Piyush and Chandra to respond to that. You don't have an option.
Which one?
What is your view on CEO compensation, given all the failures in large corporations in the past?
Let me be absolutely clear. I think compensation in the corporate world and the banking world has gotten out of hand. We have had egregious behavior, and some of the salaries have been completely outsized, and the compensation in the last 20 years. And the unfortunate bit is a lot of people, please applaud more. And I think the problem I have is a lot of these people who actually earn a lot of money then start thinking that they deserve it, and they're really that much smarter, which they aren't. I recently was with the chairman CEO of one of the largest financial institutions in the world. He was a very good individual, and I won't mention him, he's in New York. And he was telling me the story of how he has a twin sister. He was at the bottom of his class, his twin sister was at the top of the class, and she's a teacher earning $100,000, and this guy is a CEO earning many, many times that. Is it fair? Probably not. But then you could always turn around and the other side argue that why do soccer players and cricket stars earn a lot, or film actors, whoever else. So I think the world is a very unfair place. I think we need to find a new paradigm and a new equilibrium, because going back to my earlier point on the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, this is a real issue. So it is not just being, it's this sort of divide is, I think, is corrosive for society. And it's not just happening in Arab Spring, but think about Occupy Wall Street. Think about the riots in UK. Think about lots of things happening in the world today. The divide cannot go on forever.
Thank you. Harish, we have a question here on sustainability, and as a follow-on of what you said about the use of this planet. Is there something you'd like to share about your learnings in terms of building sustainable businesses? And perhaps, Sunny, at some stage, if you'd like to add to that in terms of the way that the commodities business really looks at sustainability.
Yeah. Well, I think where we are today, and this is again, the theme is pretty much the same about responsible businesses. And this whole dimension of growth, which says, of course, we all want, consistent growth and profitable growth and competitive growth. But what I call the 4G, fourth G of growth, is about responsible growth. And often in the past, companies would have a CSR program. And we have to get away from that, because CSR is not sustainable. And you have to really make sure that you are able to embed sustainability at the very heart of your business model. And for example, if you ask us, what's our business? Our business at the end of the day is marketing brands. Okay, we have 400 fantastic brands which 2 billion consumers use every day. That's our leverage. That's our multiplier. That we can actually change the planet if we can change the behaviors through our products of 2 billion people. Small actions, big difference. You multiply by 2 billion. That's our leverage. Now, the important thing, of course, is that our brands have to be at the center of social change. You cannot have a situation where we say Unilever will do some social work unless our brands begin to have a social impact. We're not going to impact the world. So when we say, and we have 3 overarching goals, for example, the first one says that we are going to reduce our environmental impact by half, end to end, from the time we source our products to the time they get consumed, because 2/3 of our impact is when people consume the product. The second bit is, we are saying 100% of all the agricultural raw material that we use, and we use 7.5 million tons today, is going to really be sourced from sustainable sources, from palm oil to tea and so on and so forth. And the third is that we are going to make sure that we improve the lives of 1 billion more people in hygiene and nutrition, because those are the places where our brands can make an impact. Now, when you begin to embrace this, you realize that you can actually do well and do good. That you can actually have a business model that allows you to do less, do more with less. And at the end of the day, that's what sustainability is about. I mean, just to give you an example, we were the first to embrace sourcing palm oil from sustainable sources. Prices, we had to pay a premium. But it was very soon that the industry realized that this has to be in the standard. And therefore the industry moved. When we launch a simple product, like a one rinse fabric conditioner, you may think, what's a big deal? It is a big deal. If we can have all our users who use fabric conditioner, use the one rinse fabric conditioner, we save 500 billion liters of water. When I was growing up in Hindustan Lever, the first thing that our vice chairman who I met told me, he said, you don't sell Lifebuoy soap, you save lives. We have the biggest hand washing program in the world. There are 8,000 kids that are dying of diarrhea every day. And what you have to do is you can actually have brands at the heart of social change. Now, I'm sure whether we run consumer goods, or banks, or services, or whatever, if you embrace sustainability at the heart of your business model, I think we can make consumption more sustainable, because what you can't deny, 85% of the world is a quality of life. So another way, of course, of doing it is to say, hey, we've done our consumption in the developed world. Now what we want you to do is not to consume. So the whole idea is you can make consumption sustainable, but it has to be at the heart of your business model.
I think Harish has very eloquently drawn the distinction between CSR and sustainability, and I would say even between philanthropy and sustainability. And I think all organizations have gone through various evolutions in what sustainability means to the company. And I think we've also moved from what we call an ethic of contribution and compliance to now an ethic of mutuality. But we have two qualifying conditions when we look at endorsing sustainability programs of the company. The first is Olam should have deep expertise in running that program, so that we can leverage all the configuration of assets and capabilities and bring it to bear to make a meaningful difference. So we have something called the Olam Livelihoods Charter, which is focused on transforming livelihoods of the farmers who are part of a supply chain. We have 3.5 million farmers who supply various agricultural commodities to us. So we offer them 8 different services, to everything from capacity building to micro lending to market access to labor practices, because in a lot of these places where, particularly in emerging market, and 80% of the countries that we have presented in the 65 are very tough emerging market geographies. You have issues of forced labor in terms of child labor, etc. So fair labor practices and how do you get them to move beyond that, that is part of the livelihood charter. Because what we have learned is that it's very easy to go into these countries and get a license from the governments to operate, but it's very, very difficult to get a license from the communities to continue to operate. The communities where you're working with, and for us it's all the rural areas and farmers, if they feel that you're a foreign company coming there to exploit their natural resources, you will be ejected irrespective of what license you've got from the government to operate. So it's extremely important they see that you're adding value to them, creating productive jobs, enhancing their capacity, and really transforming their livelihoods. The other part of sustainability for us is developing green supply chain solutions from the farm gate to the factory gate of our customers. But in that, we face 4 key developmental challenges this century and probably even in the next century. And that is really about energy security, water security, the threat of climate change, and food security. And most experts and policymakers are looking at these problems in silos and trying to make interventions. Addressing each of these as their separate problems. They're all interlinked and interlocked causes that is resulting in this. So in the last 50 years, world temperatures have gone up 0.8 degrees centigrade. If we consume the way we are consuming now, in the next 40 years, we will generate under 66 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which would mean world temperatures will go up by between 4.5 and 5 degrees centigrade. 0.8 degrees centigrade has created havoc in terms of the glacier melt. Those of you following the glacier melts, the IPCC study on environmental change is basically saying that the Himalayan glaciers are likely to melt by 2035. It supports 6 or 7 major river systems: the Ganges in India, the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, the Indus in Pakistan, the Yellow River, the Yangtze rivers in China, the Irrawaddy in Myanmar, the Mekong Delta, all supporting about 1.4 billion people engaged in agriculture dependent on these river systems. We use today 4.9 trillion cubic meters of water. By 2025, we will need 6.9 trillion cubic meters of water. 71% of the water goes into agriculture. And as our diets are transitioning in China and the developing world from a carbohydrate cereal-based diet to a protein and fat-based diet, to produce a kg of corn or wheat, we need about 1,500 kgs of water. To produce a kg of beef, we need 16,000 kgs of liters of water. So as our diets change, we're going to put more and more pressure on the planet. China's arable land is decreasing at about 0.8 to 1% a year. In 2004, the Chinese government said no more conversion of agricultural land for development purposes. Since then, and said they banned any new golf courses coming up in agricultural land. Since 2004, China has set up 400 new golf courses in agricultural land by just reclassifying it as wasteland and converting it into golf courses. There's now, our fleet population in the world has reached 1 billion this year. It's touching 1 billion fleet population, cars and everything else. Every car you add to the fleet population, you have to set aside 0.07 hectares of land for the roads and the parking lots to support those cars. Chinese car population today is about 80 billion. right? There's an estimate out there, by 2035, China will have the same car usage ratio as Japan, 1 car for every 2 people, which means 630 million cars. 50 million hectares of agricultural land in China will go out. China today has 90 million hectares of agricultural land for its food crops, and that hasn't grown an acre for the last 15 years. So how does China solve its problem? It imports water by importing soybeans. This year it imported 60 million tons of soybeans. To produce it, it has to put about 33 million hectares under cultivation. So we face a very huge crisis on water security, food security, climate change and energy security. And if we can fight wars over energy, we will fight much bigger wars over water. The idea is not to reassure you today. I'm deliberately provoking you and making you restless about this problem, because I think it requires all of us in this room as leaders to do something about this.
This whole issue of responsible business coming from the banking industry in the spate of the last 5 years, I can't help but comment on it. It's not sustainability per se, but definitely responsible business. I share Shankar's view. I think over the last 25 years, not only has comp in banking been egregious, but also what banking stands for, i.e. the range of activities within the financial service industry have gone a little haywire. The truth is banks perform a useful social function. That's why banks were formed 500 years ago. We intermediate across time and we intermediate across risk. So, you're young, you want to buy a car, you want to buy a house, you're going to save money, you're going to have a pension, you're going to have money when you're older. So you want to be able to buy things now, but you want to pay for them later in time. You want to set up a business which is going to give you cash flows in the future, so you want to be financed now, you're going to be able to pay back in time. So banks perform useful functions. As an industry, we lost our bearings. So a lot of what the industry does is speculative, as opposed to supporting real economy and real business. But I think banks need to do that. In Singapore, we have 4.5 million customers. 90% of people in Singapore have a relationship with DBS or POSB, more particularly. The reality is that 2.5 out of the 4.5 million customers lose us money. So we don't make money on 2.5 million customers. Most of them are in the POSB franchise. Most of them live in the heartlands and hinterlands of Singapore. One of the things which DBS has debated in the past is, do we really need to be in this business? We lose money. It's not good commercial business. But it's quite clear to us that we have a responsibility in Singapore which far transcends our commercial agenda. We are the people's bank. If you are a school kid, or if you are a pensioner, or if you are somebody in HDB, you will go to POSB. And recognizing that we have a real social role to play, that we have an agenda that is responsible, and a lot more than just making the next buck and the P&L. That's important to us, because not only is it good because we want to do good, it's good because from a franchise standpoint, it is an integral part of what we are. We would lose a lot more as a firm by not doing what we should be doing than we would gain. The recognition that doing a business responsibly can actually add to the overall shareholder, not only multiple stakeholders, but can give positive contribution to shareholder. That is a realization that must come.
I can just jump in. Absolutely agree. But the other thing I think businesses, and particularly banks, need to do is talk more and more about what they do for promoting economic growth. Because that, I think, is very much a sustainability agenda for the world at large. I don't think we do a good job. We at Standard Chartered have $23 billion of outstandings to SMEs. The lending we do to microfinance institutions has created more than 6 million jobs. We have financed renewable energy projects for more than $10 billion just in the last 4 or 5 years. We need to do a better job of getting the narrative out and to change the dialogue.
Thank you very much. We've had such a fascinating discussion. We're completely out of time. But I'm going to make one request, which is that the #1 question over there with 18 votes. Any tips on balancing work and life as you grow? I'm going to request your better halves, Rana, who's here, and Chira, who's here, to try and answer that question for our audience. while we make way for the next show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunny Shankar.